What if the quiet mechanic working the late shift at a small regional airport, just another exhausted single dad trying to make ends meet, was once the most legendary test pilot in aviation history? And what if, when a billionaire's private jet carrying 200 souls lost all control, at 41,000 feet, he uttered just 3 words over the emergency channel that made every air traffic controller in the country freeze? This is the story of Mitchell Rhodes. This is a tale about hidden greatness, impossible odds, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, but emerges exactly when the world needs it most. If stories of redemption, unexpected heroes, and the power of second chances stir something deep within you, make sure to subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more incredible true tales that remind us why humanity is worth believing in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, surrounding Clearwater Regional Airport, painting the tarmac in shades of amber and rose. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and the world was still half asleep. Inside Hangar 7, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of parked aircraft waiting for their scheduled maintenance checks. Mitchell Rhodes stood beneath the belly of a Cessna Citation, wrench in hand, his work coverall stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. His name was stitched in faded red thread over the chest pocket, the letters barely visible after years of washing. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking valve connections, testing pressure gauges, running his calloused fingers along fuel lines with the practiced touch of someone who could diagnose problems by feel alone. To anyone watching, he was just another aircraft mechanic clocking in before sunrise. Another face in the sea of maintenance crews that kept regional airports running. But the way he moved told a different story. There was precision in every gesture, a methodical grace that spoke of training far beyond what any technical school could provide. His eyes, sharp and focused despite the early hour, missed nothing. On his wrist, barely visible beneath the sleeve of his coveralls, was a watch. Not the cheap digital kind most mechanics wore, but a vintage Breitling Navitimer, its face scratched and worn, the kind of chronograph only serious pilots carried. The crystal was clouded with age, but the mechanism inside still ticked with Swiss precision, counting seconds that once measured altitude changes and fuel consumption at speeds most people would never experience. Mitchell wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back to inspect his work. The Citation's landing gear assembly gleamed under the lights, every bolt torqued to exact specifications, every connection secure. He made a notation on his clipboard, his handwriting surprisingly neat for someone who worked with his hands all day. "Rhodes, you're still here?" A voice called from across the hangar. Jerry Watkins, the day shift supervisor, walked toward him carrying 2 paper coffee cups. He was a broad man with a salt and pepper beard and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years staring at aircraft in bright sunlight. Mitchell accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Just finishing up the Citation. She's good to go." Jerry glanced at the checklist, his eyebrows rising slightly. "You knocked out the entire inspection solo?" "That's usually a 2-man job." "Couldn't sleep," Mitchell said simply, which was true enough. Sleep had become something he negotiated with rather than enjoyed. Too many nights lying awake, listening to the distant sound of jets taking off from the commercial side of the airport, their engines calling to something deep in his chest that he'd tried to bury years ago. Jerry studied him for a moment, concern flickering across his weathered face. "You working a double again?" "Mitchell, you've pulled 4 this week already. When's the last time you actually went home?" "I'm fine," Mitchell said, the words automatic. He'd said them so many times they'd lost all meaning. "Tommy's at my sister's place in Brookhaven until Saturday. Gives me time to pick up extra shifts." The mention of his son, his 12-year-old, brought the familiar tightness to his chest. Tommy, who barely remembered a time when his father wasn't exhausted, wasn't working himself into the ground trying to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Tommy, who looked at him sometimes with questions in his eyes that Mitchell didn't know how to answer. Jerry sighed. Look, I get it. Single parent, bills to pay. Been there myself. But you keep burning the candle at both ends like this, you're gonna crash. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And Mitchell, I don't know what you did before you came here, and I'm not asking. But the way you work on these planes, it's like you're not just fixing them. It's like you're remembering something. Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He took a long sip of coffee, using the moment to compose his response. Just doing my job, Jerry. Yeah, Jerry said quietly. Just seems like a waste is all. Talent like yours. He clapped Mitchell on the shoulder. Anyway, there's a private jet coming in around noon. Some tech billionaire's plane. They're requesting a full systems diagnostic before they continue to Seattle. Figured you'd want the overtime. Mitchell nodded. Overtime meant he could finally replace Tommy's winter jacket, the one that was 2 sizes too small, but his son insisted on wearing because it had been a gift from his late mother. I'll take it. Figured you would, Jerry said with a small smile. Aircraft's a Gulfstream G650, top of the line. Should be interesting. As Jerry walked away, Mitchell returned his attention to the citation, running through his final checks. His hands moved across the aircraft with unconscious familiarity, touching surfaces, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there, listening to the subtle sounds that told him everything he needed to know about the machine's health. This was his life now. Quiet, anonymous, safe. He fixed planes instead of flying them, kept his head down, collected his paycheck, and went home to a son who deserved better than a father haunted by a past he couldn't talk about. No one here knew who he'd been. No one knew the records he'd set, the experimental aircraft he'd pushed beyond every known limit, the classified missions that had made his call sign whispered with reverence in certain circles. Here, he was just Mitchell Rhodes, mechanic. Not test pilot Mitchell Rhodes, who'd flown prototype fighters at Mach 3, who'd landed damaged aircraft that should have killed him, who'd been recruited by 3 different governments and turned them all down. Not the Mitchell Rhodes whose face had once been on the cover of Aviation Week magazine, youngest test pilot ever to receive the Collier Trophy. That person had died in a fireball over the Nevada desert 7 years ago. At least, that's what the official report said. And Mitchell had done nothing to correct them. Because the truth was far more complicated, far more painful, and involved a choice between the sky he loved and the family he loved more. He'd chosen family. And then, 6 months later, his wife Emma had died in a car accident, leaving him alone with a 5-year-old who asked every night when Mommy was coming home. By the time Tommy stopped asking, Mitchell had already burned every bridge to his old life. The legendary test pilot was gone. Only the mechanic remained. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the hangar's high windows. Mitchell gathered his tools, returned them to their precise places in his rolling toolbox, and headed toward the break room. He had 6 hours before the Billionaire's Gulfstream arrived. Time enough to catch a nap in his truck, maybe grab some breakfast from the vending machine. As he walked across the tarmac, a shadow passed overhead. He looked up instinctively, his trained eye immediately identifying the aircraft. A Boeing 737. Gear down, on final approach to the commercial runway. Perfect glide slope, textbook landing configuration. He watched it touch down with the critical eye of someone who'd made thousands of landings himself, noting the slight bounce on the main gear. The quick correction from the pilot. For just a moment, muscle memory flooded through him. His hands tingled with the phantom sensation of control yokes. His feet remembered the pressure of rudder pedals. His body recalled the feeling of an aircraft responding to his slightest input, like an extension of his own will. Then the moment passed. The 737 rolled out and turned toward the terminal. Mitchell shoved his hands in his pockets and walked toward his truck. Just another tired mechanic at the end of another shift. With no reason to believe that in a few hours everything would change. The sky called to him every day. Today, finally, it would demand an answer. The coffee in the break room was burnt and bitter, but Mitchell drank it anyway. He sat alone at a corner table, his back to the wall out of habit, watching the morning shift filter in through the heavy metal door. Voices rose and fell in easy conversation, talking about weekend plans, complaining about the weather, debating which was the best pizza place in Clearwater. Mitchell listened without participating. He'd perfected the art of being present without actually being there, of seeming friendly while maintaining a wall that kept people at a comfortable distance. It was easier that way. Friendships required history, and his history was something he couldn't share. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Rachel. "Tommy wants to know if you're coming to his soccer game Saturday. I told him you'd try." You'd try. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mitchell's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Try. That word carried so much weight, so much unspoken disappointment. He typed back, "I'll be there, promise." He'd made that promise before and broken it. Overtime shifts, emergency repairs, the constant need for just one more paycheck to cover just one more bill. But this time would be different. This time he'd actually show up, actually be the father Tommy deserved instead of the ghost who left before dawn and returned after dark. "Hey Rhodes, you hear about the plane coming in?" Dave Chen, one of the younger mechanics, pulled up a chair uninvited. He was fresh out of technical school, still excited about every aircraft that rolled through the hangar. Gulfstream G650 belongs to that tech CEO, Danessa Voren. You know, the woman who started Nextcore? She's worth like $15 billion. Mitchell shrugged noncommittally. Names and numbers like that meant nothing to him. Rich people flew expensive planes. This was not news. "Come on, man, show some enthusiasm," Dave laughed. "This is the kind of plane you dream about working on. Twin Rolls-Royce engines, fly-by-wire controls, can cross the Atlantic without refueling. It's basically a spaceship with wings." "It's just a plane," Mitchell said quietly. But even as he spoke, something stirred in his chest. A G650. He'd never flown one, but he'd read the specs years ago. Back when he still subscribed to aviation journals. Back when he still cared about things like maximum cruise altitude and fuel efficiency. Dave was still talking, oblivious to Mitchell's withdrawal. "I heard she's flying from New York to Seattle for some conference. 200 people on board, corporate executives, investors. Can you imagine being responsible for that many lives? The pressure?" Mitchell could imagine it perfectly. Had lived it. The weight of responsibility was something you carried in your bones, especially when things went wrong. He still had nightmares about the test flight that had ended his career. Not the crash itself, which he barely remembered, but the moments before when he'd known something was catastrophically wrong and had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to try to save the aircraft or save himself. He'd chosen to save the aircraft. Had almost succeeded. The experimental fighter had been carrying data worth millions, prototype systems that couldn't be replicated. He'd nursed it through failing hydraulics and a fire in the port engine, had coaxed it back toward the test range instead of punching out over the desert. He'd gotten it within sight of the runway before the flight controls finally gave up completely. The crash had been spectacular. The kind of fireball that made it into compilation videos online. By the time the rescue crews arrived, there was nothing left but twisted metal and smoke. They'd searched for 3 days before officially declaring, "Test pilot Mitchell Rhodes dead." What they didn't know was that he'd ejected at the last possible second. Had pulled the handle when the ground was so close that his parachute barely had time to deploy. He'd landed hard in a ravine 5 miles from the crash site, broken ribs screaming, right leg shattered. But alive, he'd laid there in the desert heat, bleeding and broken, and made a decision. Emma had begged him for years to quit, to choose his family over the increasingly dangerous test flights. She was pregnant with Tommy, terrified every time he kissed her goodbye, and climbed into an experimental aircraft that might not bring him back. "Please," she'd whispered the night before that final flight. "Please just walk away. We need you more than the sky does." So lying in that ravine, listening to helicopters searching for his body, Mitchell Rhodes had done something unthinkable. He'd let them believe he was dead, had dragged himself to a highway, flagged down a truck driver, and spun a story about a hiking accident. Paid cash for a bus ticket to California. Disappeared. For 6 months, he'd lived as a ghost. Changed his name, worked cash jobs, sent anonymous money orders to Emma. He'd planned to surprise her, to show up at the house and explain everything, to start fresh. He'd imagined her tears of joy, Tommy's confused but happy face, the life they'd finally have together. Instead, he'd arrived to find the house empty, a realtor's sign on the lawn, and neighbors who awkwardly explained about the accident, the drunk driver who'd run a red light, the funeral he'd missed because he'd been pretending to be dead. The guilt had nearly killed him. Still was killing him, slowly, day by day. He'd sacrificed his career to be with his family, and his sacrifice had meant he wasn't there when they needed him most. Emma had died thinking he was already gone. Tommy had lost both parents in the span of 6 months. Mitchell had seriously considered just staying dead. It would have been easier. But there was Tommy, 5 years old and alone except for Rachel, and Mitchell couldn't abandon his son the way he'd already abandoned everyone else. So he'd come back, claimed to be a distant cousin of the deceased pilot, produced forged documents, and fought for custody. Rachel knew the truth, had recognized him immediately despite the beard and the weight loss and the haunted look in his eyes. She'd helped him navigate the legal system, had backed his story, had never once asked if it was worth it. Because they both knew the answer. Tommy was worth anything, but keeping Tommy meant staying dead. The moment Mitchell Rhodes, legendary test pilot, resurfaced, questions would be asked. Investigations would be opened. And there was a very real chance he'd lose custody of his son to a system that didn't look kindly on people who faked their own deaths. Even for good reasons. So he'd taken the name of a real person, a distant relative who died years ago, had obtained genuine documents through channels he didn't want to think too hard about, and had become someone else. Someone ordinary. Someone forgettable. Someone who fixed planes instead of flying them. Most days, he could almost believe he was that person. Most days, the ache in his chest when he watched planes take off was bearable. Most days, he didn't stand at Tommy's bedroom door at night and wonder what Emma would think of the choices he'd made, the life he was giving their son. But some days, like today, the weight of his double life pressed down until he could barely breathe. Some days he caught his reflection in a polished aircraft surface and didn't recognize the man staring back. Some days he wondered if the crash really had killed him, and this was just a particularly vivid dream his dying brain had conjured in those final seconds before impact. "Rhodes? You still with us?" Dave was waving a hand in front of his face. Mitchell blinked, forcing himself back to the present. "Yeah, sorry, long night. I was saying the Gulfstream's landing in an hour. Jerry wants you to lead the diagnostic. Apparently the owner specifically requested our best mechanic." Dave grinned. "That's you, in case you were wondering." Mitchell nodded, standing up and dumping his coffee in the sink. "Our best mechanic. If they only knew. If they knew that the man checking their fuel lines had once landed a prototype fighter with no hydraulics and one engine, using only differential thrust and prayer. If they knew that their quiet, antisocial coworker held 3 civilian speed records that still stood because the aircraft he'd flown to set them had been classified. But they didn't know. couldn't know. And that's how it had to stay. For Tommy's sake, if nothing else. The boy deserved a father who was present, even if that father was living a lie. Even if that father woke up some nights with his hands shaking, reaching for controls that weren't there, landing planes that existed only in memory and nightmare. "Coming?" Dave asked from the doorway. "Right behind you," Mitchell said. He followed the younger man out into the bright morning, toward the hangar where the Gulfstream would soon arrive, carrying its billionaire owner, and 200 souls who had no idea that their aircraft would soon be in the hands of a dead man. The universe, Mitchell had learned, had a cruel sense of humor. He'd spent 7 years running from his past, hiding his skills, keeping his head down. Today, whether he knew it or not, all of that was about to end, because sometimes the sky doesn't let you go. Sometimes it waits, patient and inevitable, until the moment you're needed most. And then it reaches down and reminds you exactly who you used to be. The Gulfstream appeared on the horizon right on schedule, sunlight glinting off its sleek fuselage as it began its descent toward Clearwater Regional. Mitchell watched it approach, something stirring in his chest that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Just another plane, he told himself. Just another inspection. Just another day of being someone he wasn't, doing work that was beneath him. Living a life that felt like waiting. He had no way of knowing he was wrong about all of it. The Gulfstream, G650, touched down with barely a whisper, its tires kissing the runway with the kind of precision that spoke of an experienced pilot at the controls. Mitchell watched from the hangar entrance as the sleek aircraft taxied toward them, its white paint gleaming in the midday sun, a subtle gold stripe running along the fuselage just below the windows. Even from a distance, it was clearly a machine built for luxury and speed in equal measure. Jerry appeared at his shoulder, clipboard in hand. "Beautiful bird, isn't she?" Owners already radioed ahead. "Wants a complete systems check before continuing to Seattle." Apparently they've been getting some intermittent warning lights on the flight management system. Probably just a sensor glitch, but with that many people on board, can't be too careful. Mitchell nodded, his eyes tracking the aircraft as it rolled to a stop on the apron about 50 yards from the hangar. The engine spooled down with a descending whine that triggered another cascade of muscle memory. He could feel, as clearly as if he were sitting in the cockpit, exactly what the pilot was doing right now. Throttles to idle, fuel cutoff levers, battery master switches. The familiar dance of shutdown procedures that he'd performed thousands of times. "You good to handle this?" Jerry asked. "I can assign Dave to assist if you want." "I'm fine solo," Mitchell said. The truth was, he preferred working alone. Fewer questions that way. Fewer opportunities for someone to notice that he worked on aircraft with the intimacy of a pilot rather than the detachment of a mechanic. The forward cabin door opened, and a set of air stairs extended automatically. The first person to emerge was a woman in her early 50s, dressed in an immaculately tailored navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in a style that managed to look both professional and effortless. Even from this distance, she carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room. "That's her," Jerry said, unnecessary awe creeping into his voice. "Danessa Voren, CEO of Nexcore Technologies. Built the company from nothing in her garage 20 years ago. Now it's worth $90 billion. Mitchell watched as more passengers disembarked. Corporate types mostly, carrying briefcases and laptops, squinting in the bright sunlight, already pulling out phones to check messages. About 30 people total emerged before the flow stopped. Voren herself stood to one side, speaking with a younger woman who appeared to be an assistant, gesturing toward the aircraft and then toward the terminal building. "Where are the other 170 people?" Mitchell asked. Jerry laughed. "Oh no. The G650's configured for like 19 passengers maximum. When I said 200 people, I meant their Seattle conference has 200 attendees. Just this group flying in from New York. Mitchell felt something in his chest loosen slightly. 19 people. Still a significant responsibility, but not the catastrophic numbers he'd been imagining. Not that it mattered. Planes didn't care how many people they carried. Metal fatigue and hydraulic failures and electrical problems affected billionaires and their executives the same way they affected everyone else. Physics played no favorites. A black SUV appeared from the direction of the terminal, clearly arranged in advance to transport the passengers. Voron spoke briefly with the pilot, a gray-haired man in his 60s who'd emerged last from the cockpit, still wearing his captain's epaulettes. The pilot nodded at whatever she said, then turned and walked toward the hangar. Captain Richard Moss, according to the flight plan Mitchell had reviewed earlier. 30 years experience, former commercial airline pilot, now flying private jets for the ultra-wealthy. He had the weathered look of someone who'd logged tens of thousands of hours in the air, that particular alertness that never quite faded even on the ground. "You the mechanic?" Moss asked as he approached, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent a lifetime talking over engine noise. "Mitchell Rhodes," he said, extending a hand. The captain's grip was firm and brief. "We've been getting intermittent master caution lights for the last hour of flight. Flight management computer keeps throwing error codes, then clearing them. Everything else checks normal. Engine parameters are good. But something's hinky with the avionics." Mitchell pulled out his diagnostic tablet. "Any pattern to when the warnings appear?" "That's the weird part," Moss said, frowning. "Seems random. Sometimes during cruise, sometimes during descent. We tried resetting the system twice, no change. Could be a bad sensor. Could be a wiring issue. Could be the computer itself starting to glitch." He paused. "Look, I know Ms. Voron wants to get to Seattle today, but I'm not taking that plane up again until someone figures out what's going on. I've got 19 souls to worry about, and intermittent electrical problems at altitude are how people die." There was something in the way Moss said it. A gravity that went beyond standard caution. That told Mitchell this captain had probably lost someone once, or come very close. That kind of wariness wasn't taught in flight school. It was earned through experience, usually painful experience. "I'll find it," Mitchell said simply. Moss studied him for a moment. The way experienced pilots sometimes evaluated people, looking for competence beneath surface appearances. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded. "Aircraft's all yours. I'll be in operations if you need me." He handed over a folder containing the flight logs and maintenance records. "And Rhodes? I saw the way you were watching her land. You know planes. Really know them. So I'm trusting you to tell me the truth, not what the owner wants to hear. We clear?" "Clear," Mitchell said, meeting the captain's eyes. After Moss walked away, Jerry let out a low whistle. "He read you pretty good. Noticed you watching like a pilot, not a mechanic." Mitchell didn't respond. He was already walking toward the Gulf Stream, his mind shifting into the focused state that had once made him one of the most respected test pilots in the world. Intermittent electrical problems. Those were always the hardest to diagnose because they came and went, hiding their causes. Lurking in the system like ghosts. The interior of the G650 was exactly what he'd expected. Cream-colored leather seats arranged in a conference-style layout. Polished wood veneer. Soft lighting. The kind of cabin that cost more to outfit than most people's houses. But Mitchell barely registered the luxury. His attention was on the cockpit, visible through the open door at the front. He stepped into the flight deck, and for a moment, just a moment, time seemed to stop. The familiar layout of instruments and displays, the control yokes waiting patiently, the throttle quadrant between the seats, all of it hit him with an almost physical force. His hands remembered exactly where everything would be, muscle memory so deep it bypassed conscious thought. He could sit down right now and fly this aircraft without hesitation, without even glancing at the checklist, but he didn't sit down. Couldn't let himself. Instead, he focused on the center pedestal where the flight management computers were located. He connected his diagnostic tablet to the data port and began pulling error logs. The screen filled with codes, timestamps, system warnings. Nothing that should have caused a master caution. Nothing that explained the intermittent nature of the problem. Mitchell worked methodically, the way he'd been trained decades ago. The way he'd honed through countless hours of troubleshooting experimental systems that no one else understood. He pulled access panels, inspected wiring bundles, tested voltage levels, checked connection integrity. An hour passed, then another. The sun shifted across the sky, shadows growing longer inside the hangar. He found the problem in the last place he looked, which was how it always worked. A wire bundle behind the main instrument panel showed signs of intermittent contact. The insulation was worn, probably from years of vibration. And under certain conditions, likely when the aircraft went through specific power configurations or attitude changes, the bare wire was making contact with the frame, creating a ground fault that triggered false warnings. It was fixable. Would take maybe 3 hours to properly repair the damaged section and reroute the bundle. But it explained everything Moss had described. And more importantly, it was exactly the kind of problem that could become catastrophic at the wrong moment. Wire failures had brought down airliners before. What started as intermittent warnings could cascade into actual system failures, especially if the damage propagated to other circuits. Mitchell was so focused on documenting the problem that he didn't hear footsteps behind him until a voice spoke. Sharp and professional. "So what's the verdict? Can we fly today or not?" He turned to find Danessa Voren standing in the cabin, having apparently dismissed her assistant and returned alone. Up close, she was even more striking than from a distance. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that evaluated everything with predatory intelligence. The kind of presence that made it clear why she'd built a tech empire from nothing. "There's a wiring issue in the flight management system," Mitchell said, climbing down from the cockpit. "Intermittent ground fault. It's fixable, but not quickly. You're looking at minimum 3 hours, probably 4 to do it right." Voren's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The conference starts tomorrow morning. I'm the keynote speaker. I can't miss it." "Then you'll need to find another aircraft," Mitchell said evenly. "Because this one isn't safe to fly." Her eyes narrowed. The captain said it was just warning lights. Everything else checked normal. "Warning lights don't appear for no reason," Mitchell said, pulling up the error logs on his tablet and turning it so she could see. "This is what your flight management computer was trying to tell you. The warnings were real. You're lucky you made it here without a complete electrical failure." Without a complete electrical failure. He watched her process this information, saw the calculations happening behind her eyes. She wasn't stupid. Probably knew more about electrical systems than most people, given her tech background. But she also clearly wasn't used to hearing the word no. What if we just disconnected the faulty circuit and flew on backup systems? She asked. "You could," Mitchell said. "And you'd probably make it to Seattle just fine. But if something else went wrong, if you had an actual emergency, you'd be flying a $15 million aircraft with degraded systems and no way to know what else might fail. Is your keynote speech worth 19 lives?" The question hung in the air between them, blunt and unavoidable. Voren stared at him, and Mitchell got the distinct impression she was reevaluating her initial assessment of who and what he was. Most mechanics wouldn't have pushed back this hard against a billionaire client. Most mechanics would have told her what she wanted to hear. "You're not just a mechanic, are you?" she said quietly. Mitchell's heart rate kicked up, but his expression remained neutral. I'm qualified to perform the inspection your captain requested. That's all you need to know." "No," she said slowly, still studying him with those sharp, evaluating eyes. "The way you talk about aircraft systems. The way you were standing in the cockpit when I came in. You looked like you belonged there." She paused. "You're a pilot." "I work on planes," Mitchell said, deliberately not answering the question. "And right now, I'm telling you this one needs 3 to 4 hours of work before it's safe to fly. That's my professional assessment. What you do with that information is your decision." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Voren pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and held it to her ear. "Sarah? I need you to book commercial flights to Seattle for everyone, departing this evening. Yes, I know it's last minute. Make it happen." She ended the call and looked back at Mitchell. "Fix it properly. I'll fly commercial today, but I want my plane ready to bring us back on Saturday." Mitchell nodded. "It will be." Voren started to leave, then paused at the cabin door. "What's your name again?" "Mitchell Rhodes." "Well, Mitchell Rhodes," she said, something unreadable in her expression. "Thank you for being honest. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. It's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't." After she left, Mitchell stood alone in the empty aircraft, his hands slightly unsteady as he gathered his tools. That had been too close. She'd seen too much, noticed things that no one else at the airport had caught in 7 years, but it was fine. She'd be gone in a few hours, off to Seattle, and he'd repair her plane and never see her again. His secret was safe. His quiet life would continue. Tommy would never have to know that his father had once been someone else entirely. Mitchell told himself all of this as he returned to the flight deck, as he began the painstaking work of repairing the damaged wiring. He told himself everything would be fine. That this was just another day, just another job. Just another aircraft passing through his life without consequence. He had no idea how spectacularly wrong he was about to be, because sometimes the universe doesn't just throw you a curveball. Sometimes it waits until you're finally comfortable, finally convinced that the past is buried. And then it detonates everything you've built with surgical precision. And sometimes that detonation begins with something as simple as a frayed wire. A delayed flight and a billionaire who notices things she shouldn't. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in less than 48 hours, Mitchell Rhodes would have to choose between the life he'd built and the person he used to be. Between staying hidden and saving lives. Between being a mechanic and remembering how to fly. The decision when it came would be no decision at all. Because some things you can bury. Some things you can run from. But what you truly are, at your core, always finds a way to surface. Always. Saturday morning arrived with clouds the color of old bruises, stacking up over the mountains. Mitchell stood in the Clearwater Regional parking lot at 6 a.m., coffee steaming in his hand, watching the weather system roll in with the practiced eye of someone who'd flown through conditions that would ground most pilots. The meteorological reports called it a standard autumn storm front, nothing unusual for this time of year. But something about the way the clouds were building, the particular quality of the light, made his instincts prickle with unease. He'd worked late into Thursday night and all day Friday repairing the Gulfstream's wiring system. The job had taken longer than expected because he'd refused to cut corners, insisting on replacing entire harness sections rather than just patching the damaged areas. Jerry had grumbled about the overtime costs, but Captain Moss had approved every hour without question. Recognizing thoroughness when he saw it, the aircraft sat in the hangar now, fully repaired and tested, waiting for Voren's return from Seattle. According to the flight plan filed yesterday, they were scheduled to depart Seattle at 10 a.m., putting them into Clearwater on 1 p.m., right when the storm front was predicted to hit. Mitchell had checked the weather forecast 3 times already this morning, each time hoping the system would slow down or shift course. It hadn't. His phone buzzed. Rachel's number. He answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you're not at the airport," his sister said without preamble. "Tommy's soccer game isn't until 3, Mitchell replied. "I'll be there. I promised." "Mitchell, the weather's turning bad. They're saying possible severe thunderstorms this afternoon. Whatever you're working on, it can wait." He looked up at the darkening sky. "The plane I repaired is flying back today. I need to be here when it lands. Make sure everything's functioning properly after the repairs." Rachel sighed, the sound carrying years of frustration and worry. "You know what your problem is? You care more about machines than people. That plane doesn't need you. Your son does." The words hit harder than she probably intended. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Her voice softened slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to fight with you. I just want Tommy to have his dad there for once. He asks about you constantly. Tells his friends his father is a pilot. Did you know that? Not a mechanic. A pilot. Like he knows somehow." Mitchell's grip tightened on the phone. "I'll be there by 3. I swear." After ending the call, he stood in the parking lot for another moment, torn between competing obligations. Rachel was right, of course. Tommy deserved better. But the thought of that Gulfstream landing with untested repairs, of not being there to verify the systems were functioning correctly, made his chest tight with anxiety. He'd spent 2 days on that wiring. He needed to see it through. Just this one last thing, he told himself. Then he'd focus entirely on being the father Tommy deserved. Just this one last aircraft, this one last repair, this one last responsibility. After today, he'd start saying no to overtime. Start being present. Start building the relationship with his son that 7 years of grief and guilt had prevented. Inside the airport operations center, the mood was tense. Mitchell found Captain Moss hunched over a weather display, frowning at the radar imagery showing the approaching storm system. The older pilot looked up as Mitchell entered. "Rhodes, glad you're here. We've got a problem." "The weather," Mitchell said. Moss nodded grimly. "Seattle's reporting they can't get clearance to depart until the system passes. The front's moving faster than predicted. They're grounded for at least 4 hours, maybe 6. Ms. Vaughan is not happy about the delay." Something about the way Moss said it suggested there was more to the story. Mitchell waited. "She's pushing to fly anyway," Moss continued. "Wants to route around the storm, come in from the north. I told her that adds 90 minutes to the flight time and puts us threading the needle between 2 separate weather systems. She doesn't care. Says she has critical meetings Monday morning and needs her aircraft back in New York tonight. Can you fly the route she wants?" Mitchell asked. Moss was quiet for a moment. "Technically, yes. I've got the hours and the ratings. But I don't like it. Too many variables. Weather at altitude is unpredictable right now, and if something goes wrong, our divert options are limited." He looked at Mitchell directly. "I cleared that aircraft. You fixed it. But I'm asking you pilot to pilot, is it really ready?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Mitchell felt his carefully constructed walls crack slightly. "You know, I suspected when I met you," Moss said. "Confirmed it when I looked up your name and found a death certificate for a test pilot named Mitchell Rhodes from 7 years ago. I'm guessing there's a story there, and I'm guessing you don't want to tell it. That's fine. But I need to know if you're certain about those repairs." Mitchell's mind raced. How many others had made the same connection? How long until someone decided to dig deeper, to ask uncomfortable questions? But those concerns felt distant compared to the immediate situation. "The repairs are solid. I replaced the entire forward avionics harness, upgraded the connector blocks, tested every circuit 3 times. That aircraft is safer now than it was when it rolled off the production line." Moss studied him, then nodded slowly. "Good enough for me." He turned back to the weather display. I'll try one more time to convince Ms. Voren to wait out the storm. But if she insists on flying, at least I know the aircraft won't be what kills us. At least I know the aircraft won't be what kills us. The words were meant as dark humor, but they sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. He looked at the radar display, at the angry red and orange cells marching across the screen, and felt the old instincts firing. Weather systems like this were dangerous not because of what you could see, but because of what you couldn't. Hidden wind shear, sudden updrafts and downdrafts, ice accumulation that could happen in seconds. He'd flown through worse during his test pilot days, but never willingly, and never with passengers who had no idea what they were risking. "Captain Moss to operations," a voice crackled over the radio. "We have a transmission from Gulfstream November 7-4 Delta Fox." Moss grabbed the handset. "This is Moss, go ahead." Danessa Voren's voice came through, clipped and decisive even through the static. "Captain, we've been cleared for departure. Flight plan filed for northern route as discussed. Estimated time of arrival Clearwater is 2:45 p.m. I trust the aircraft is ready." Moss glanced at Mitchell, then keyed the mic. "Ma'am, I strongly advise waiting for the weather to clear. The forecast shows significant deterioration in the next few hours. I have a board meeting in New York at 8 a.m. Monday morning that cannot be rescheduled," Voren replied. "We're flying today. See you in a few hours." The radio clicked off. Moss set down the handset with more force than necessary. "Billionaires," he muttered. "Think money makes them immune to physics." Mitchell said nothing. He was already doing calculations in his head, mapping the route Voren would be taking against the weather patterns, identifying the danger zones where the two storm systems would create the most unstable air. The northern approach would bring them over the mountains during the worst part of the afternoon, when daytime heating combined with the storm dynamics to create the most violent conditions. Jerry appeared in the doorway. "Rhodes, I thought you were taking the afternoon off for your kids' game." "Change of plans," Mitchell said, not taking his eyes off the weather display. "I'm staying until the Gulfstream lands." "That's not for another 8 hours. I'll be here." Jerry looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Mitchell's expression stopped him. "Your call. But you're already way over on overtime this week. I can't approve much more." "Clock me out then," Mitchell said. "I'll stay off the books." After Jerry left, Moss turned to him with a knowing look. "You feel it too. Something's wrong." It wasn't a question. Mitchell nodded slowly. "I've seen weather like this before. It looks manageable on the surface, but there are pockets where everything converges and hell breaks loose." He paused. "I flew through a system like this once during a test flight. Lost an engine, nearly lost the aircraft. It was like the sky just decided to stop playing by the rules." "You ever think about going back to it?" Moss asked quietly. "Flying, I mean." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Every single day. But you don't." "I can't." He didn't elaborate. Couldn't explain about Tommy, about Emma, about the impossible choice between the sky and the family that no longer existed. Couldn't explain how every time he watched a plane take off, he felt like he was suffocating. Moss nodded like he understood anyway. "For what it's worth, you've got the instincts. Even just watching you work, talking to you about systems, I can tell you were one of the good ones." He clapped Mitchell on the shoulder. "I'm going to grab some food before they land. You should do the same. Going to be a long afternoon." But Mitchell couldn't eat. The tension building in his chest made everything else feel irrelevant. He spent the next few hours obsessively checking weather updates, tracking the Gulfstream's progress through flight tracking software, watching the storm systems evolve and shift in ways that made his unease grow with each passing hour. At 1 p.m. He texted Rachel. "Might be late to the game. Aircraft situation. I'm sorry." Her response came back almost immediately. "He's going to be devastated." Mitchell stared at the text, guilt crushing down on him. But what else could he do? Walk away while 19 people flew into a weather system that was rapidly becoming more dangerous? Pretend he didn't see what was coming just so he could watch his son play soccer? The rational part of his mind knew he was making excuses. Knew the Gulfstream had a professional crew, that Clearwater had air traffic controllers, that none of this was his responsibility. He was a mechanic who'd repaired some wiring. His job was done, but the part of him that had spent 20 years reading weather patterns and aircraft performance parameters, the part that had survived situations that should have been fatal through nothing but skill and instinct, that part couldn't let it go. Couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. At 2 p.m., the first reports of severe turbulence started coming in from aircraft in the region. A commercial 737 diverted to avoid a cell that had intensified faster than predicted. A private Cessna made an emergency landing. The pilot reporting wind shear so severe had nearly flipped the aircraft inverted. At 2:15, Mitchell watched the radar as two separate storm cells that had been predicted to remain distinct suddenly merged, creating a massive system directly along the Gulfstream's approach path. The collision of the two weather patterns was generating conditions that pilots called the blender, because that's exactly what it felt like trying to fly through it. At 2:30, Moss came running into operations, his face pale. "Rhodes, we've got a problem. The Gulfstream just reported multiple system failures. They're declaring an emergency." Mitchell's blood turned to ice. "What kind of failures?" "They're not sure yet. Everything was fine, and then suddenly they lost primary electrical. Backup systems are glitching, and they're getting warning lights across the entire panel. They're at 41,000 feet in the middle of that storm system with degraded instruments." It was impossible. Mitchell had tested every system, verified every repair. Unless something else had failed, something completely unrelated to the wiring he'd repaired. Or unless the storm had caused damage that overwhelmed even properly functioning systems. "They need to divert," Mitchell said, already moving toward the radio. "Get them on the ground anywhere they can immediately." "There's nowhere to divert," Moss said grimly. "They're in the mountains. The storm has every regional airport in the area below minimums. We're their only option, and even we're right at the edge of being too dangerous to attempt." The radio crackled to life. "Clearwater Tower, this is November 7-4 Delta Fox declaring emergency. We have multiple system failures and are requesting priority handling for immediate landing." The voice was professional, controlled, but Mitchell could hear the strain underneath. And in the background, barely audible, he could hear what sounded like shouting. Passenger panic beginning to spread as the reality of their situation became impossible to hide. Moss grabbed the radio. 7-4 Delta Fox, this is Captain Moss in operations. What's your current status? We've lost most of our primary flight displays. Flying on standby instruments. Autopilot is offline. Flight management system is completely dead. We're in severe turbulence and unable to maintain altitude. Descending through 38,000 feet. Mitchell's hands clenched into fists. This was worse than he'd thought. Without flight management systems, without autopilot, in severe turbulence with degraded instruments, that aircraft was one mistake away from an unrecoverable situation. And with passengers on board, with Voron and her entire executive team, the consequences of failure were catastrophic. "Can they make it here?" someone asked. Moss's expression was grim. "If they can stay in the air long enough. But in these conditions, with failing systems, the approach is going to be nearly impossible." Mitchell stared at the radar display, at the angry storm cells surrounding the Gulfstream's position, and made a decision he'd been avoiding for 7 years. "Get me on the radio," he said quietly. "I can talk them through it." Moss looked at him sharply. "You sure?" No. He wasn't sure about anything except that 19 people were about to die unless someone who understood what they were facing. Someone who'd been in similar situations and survived. Gave them the guidance they needed. "Put me on the radio," Mitchell repeated. His voice steady despite the chaos of emotions churning inside him. Now, because sometimes running from your past was a luxury you couldn't afford. Sometimes the sky came calling, and you had to answer whether you were ready or not. And sometimes the choice between who you'd been and who you'd become wasn't a choice at all. It was a test, and Mitchell Rhodes was about to find out if 7 years of hiding had dulled the skills that had once made him a legend, or if the person he'd been was still there, waiting for the moment when he was needed most. The moment had arrived. The operations center exploded into controlled chaos as Mitchell moved toward the radio console. Controllers scrambled to clear airspace. Emergency vehicles rolled toward their staging positions. And through the windows, the sky continued its ominous darkening. Clouds roiling like something alive, and angry. Moss handed him the headset without hesitation, stepping aside to let Mitchell take the primary communications position. "All yours." Mitchell's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the headset, but his voice when he keyed the mic was rock steady, drawing on decades of training that had become as natural as breathing. November 7-4 Delta Fox, this is Clearwater Operations. I need a complete status report. Start with your flight controls. Start with your flight controls. There was a pause, then the Gulfstream's pilot responded, his voice tight with concentration. "We have manual control, but it's sluggish. Feels like we're fighting hydraulic pressure issues. Fly-by-wire system seems to be reverting to degraded mode intermittently." Mitchell's mind immediately began processing the information, building a three-dimensional picture of the aircraft's condition. Fly-by-wire degradation meant the flight control computers weren't getting clean data from the sensors, forcing the system to fall back on less sophisticated control laws. Combined with hydraulic issues, the pilots would be fighting an aircraft that responded unpredictably, especially in turbulence. Copy that. What about your navigation systems? GPS is intermittent. We've lost both primary navigation displays. Flying on standby compass and backup instruments. We're estimating position based on last known coordinates, but in this weather, we could be several miles off course. Several miles at 38,000 feet descending into mountainous terrain in a storm was the difference between threading a safe path and flying into a granite wall. Mitchell pulled up a topographical map on the console display, overlaying it with the radar returns and the Gulfstream's last reported position. "What's your current heading?" he asked. 270, descending through 36,000 feet. Rate of descent is increasing. We're fighting to maintain level flight. Mitchell's jaw tightened. They were drifting west, which was taking them deeper into the mountain range rather than toward the valley where Clearwater was located. "You need to come right to heading 310. That will bring you parallel to the ridgeline and away from the highest terrain." "Copy," turning to 310. A pause. "Turbulence is severe. We just lost another 1,000 feet. Down to 35,000. Through the windows, lightning flickered inside the dark clouds. Great sheets of electric discharge that illuminated the storm's interior structure. Mitchell had seen weather like this only a handful of times in his career, and every single time it had tried to kill him. The Gulfstream crew was flying into something that most pilots never encountered and had no experience handling. "How many people on board?" Mitchell asked, though he already knew the answer. 19 souls including crew. The pilot's voice cracked slightly on the number. "We have the CEO of Nexcore and her entire executive team. If we go down, it's going to be national news." Mitchell closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Vanessa Voren, who'd stood in her aircraft 2 days ago and looked at him with eyes that saw too much. Voren, who'd thanked him for being honest, for not telling her what she wanted to hear. She was on that aircraft right now, experiencing the consequences of a decision to fly when she should have waited. trusting that money and will could overcome physics and chance. "Stay focused on flying the aircraft," Mitchell said firmly. "The rest doesn't matter right now. Talk to me about your engine parameters." "Both engines are running, but we're getting fluctuating readings. Could be instrumentation issues, could be actual problems. We can't tell with the displays compromised." A voice interrupted from behind Mitchell. "We've got emergency services standing by. But in this weather, if they go down in the mountains, there's nothing we can do until the storm passes." The airport's emergency coordinator, a woman named Sullivan, stood at the console with a grim expression. Mitchell ignored her, focusing entirely on the radio. "November 7-4 Delta Fox, I need you to try something. Reduce power on both engines to 75%. It's going to feel wrong, like you're giving up altitude, but it will smooth out the airflow over the wings and might stabilize your flight controls." There was hesitation on the other end. Asking pilots to reduce power during an emergency descent went against every instinct. But Mitchell knew from experience that sometimes the counterintuitive move was the right one. "Trust me on this," he added quietly. Another pause. Then, reducing power now. A longer silence, filled only with static and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, with audible relief, "That's helping. Flight controls feel more responsive. We've arrested the descent at 33,000. "Good," Mitchell said. "Now I need you to start a controlled descent to 25,000 feet. That will get you below the worst of the wind shear, but you need to do it carefully. 500 feet per minute, no more. Use pitch, not power." As the Gulfstream crew worked to stabilize their descent, Moss leaned in close to Mitchell. "You're talking them through this like you're sitting in the cockpit with them. Like you've done this before." "I have," Mitchell said simply. There was no point in denying it now. His cover was blown the moment he'd opened his mouth and started giving guidance that went far beyond what any mechanic should know. Different aircraft, different circumstances, but same principles. When everything goes wrong at altitude in bad weather, you strip it down to basics. Attitude, airspeed, heading. Everything else is noise. The radio crackled again. "We just lost cabin pressure. Masks have dropped. Passengers are panicking." Mitchell's pulse spiked. Loss of cabin pressure at 33,000 feet gave them maybe 15 seconds of useful consciousness if anyone wasn't on oxygen immediately. "Get everyone on masks now. Crew first, then help passengers. You can't save anyone if you pass out. We're on it." The strain in the pilot's voice was more pronounced now. In the background, Mitchell could hear alarms blaring. The cacophony of a flight deck in full emergency mode. Sullivan spoke up again, her voice urgent. "Mitchell, we're getting reports from Weather Service. That storm cell is intensifying. They're saying it's producing downbursts up to 70 knots. If the Gulfstream hits one of those while they're trying to descend, it could push them straight into the ground. 70-knot downbursts. Columns of air hammering down from the storm clouds with enough force to overcome any aircraft's ability to climb. They were essentially invisible, detectable only when it was too late, when you were already in one and fighting for your life." Mitchell pulled up the radar display, studying the cell structure. There, in the space between the two merging systems, was a corridor. Narrow, shifting, but potentially navigable if the Gulfstream could thread it precisely. "November 7-4 Delta Fox, I'm going to give you a series of heading changes. Follow them exactly. We're going to navigate you through a gap in the storm structure, but your margin for error is less than 2 miles on either side. Understood? Ready for headings." For the next 20 minutes, Mitchell talked the Gulfstream through a series of turns, watching their position on radar, comparing it to the weather returns, calling corrections with the precision of someone reading an instrument approach plate. Every degree of heading mattered. Every 100 feet of altitude was critical. Moss watched in silent awe as Mitchell worked, his commands coming in the calm, measured tone of someone completely in his element, despite the stakes. This wasn't a mechanic helping out during an emergency. This was a master at work. Someone who understood aircraft and weather and risk at a level that came from years of living at the edge of capability. Descending through 27,000, the Gulfstream pilot reported. Turbulence is moderating. I think we're through the worst of it. Don't get comfortable, Mitchell warned. You've still got 20 miles to fly, and the approach into Clearwater is going to be challenging. Wind shear at the surface could be severe. Roger that. And hey, whoever you are down there, thank you. You just saved our lives. Mitchell didn't respond to that. Couldn't. Because they weren't saved yet. Getting through the storm was only half the battle. Landing with compromised systems in high winds, with terrified passengers and a flight crew that had been through hell. That was going to test every skill both he and they possessed. November 7-4 Delta Fox. Give me your current position and altitude. We're at 26,000 feet. GPS just came back online briefly. Looks like we're 15 miles northwest of the field. Mitchell checked the topography. You're clear of terrain now. Begin descent to 15,000 feet. I'm going to vector you for a straight-in approach to runway 23. Wind is currently 300 at 28 gusting to 40. The numbers told a grim story. Strong crosswinds nearly 40 degrees off the runway heading, with gusts that could push a large aircraft sideways during the most critical phase of landing. Even with full systems, it would be a demanding approach. With degraded instruments and questionable flight controls, it bordered on impossible. We're going to need every bit of that runway, the Gulfstream pilot said. With our systems degraded, I'm not confident about our ability to stop. Mitchell glanced at Moss. How much runway do they need? Normally? About 5,000 feet. With no reverse thrust and questionable brakes? Moss shook his head. More than we have. Clearwater's main runway is 7,500 feet, but with this wind, they're going to use up a lot of that just fighting to stay aligned. The math was brutal and simple. The Gulfstream was likely going to run out of runway. Even if they made it through the approach, even if they managed to touch down, they might not be able to stop before running off the end into the safety area. We have crash equipment standing by, Sullivan said. Ambulances, fire trucks, the works. But Mitchell, you need to prepare them for the possibility this doesn't end well. He looked at her, then at Moss, then at the radar screen showing the Gulfstream's blip inching closer to the airport. 19 people. Danessa Varan and her team, the flight crew. All of them trusting that the voice on the radio knew what he was doing. That the guidance being given was coming from someone capable of saving them, and maybe once upon a time. Mitchell Rhodes, the test pilot, could have guaranteed that. But that person was gone, buried under 7 years of guilt and grief, and living a lie. What remained was just a mechanic who remembered how to fly, remembered the theory, but had lost the muscle memory, the instinctive responses that made the difference between life and death. Or had he? Mitchell keyed the radio again. November 7-4 Delta Fox. I'm going to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. How confident are you in making this approach? The silence stretched long enough that Mitchell knew the answer before the pilot spoke. Truthfully? Maybe 50-50. The controls are fighting me. I can't trust my instruments, and I've never landed in winds this strong with these kinds of crosswinds. If we have to go around, I don't think we have the fuel for another attempt. 50-50. A coin flip on whether 19 people lived or died. Those were not acceptable odds, not to Mitchell. Not to anyone who'd ever been responsible for bringing an aircraft safely to ground. He looked at Moss. Saw the same calculation happening behind the older pilot's eyes. Saw the question forming before Moss even spoke it. You could do it, Moss said quietly, so only Mitchell could hear. Get in the right seat. Talk him through it directly. You've got the skills. I saw how you guided them through the storm. That wasn't luck. That was mastery. Mitchell shook his head. I'm not rated on the G650. I'm not rated on anything anymore. Legally, I can't even be in that cockpit. Legal stopped mattering about 20 minutes ago when that aircraft declared an emergency, Moss countered. Right now, all that matters is getting those people on the ground alive. And you're the best chance they have. Every eye in operations was on him now. The controllers, the emergency coordinator, the handful of other airport personnel who'd gathered to watch the drama unfold. All of them waiting for Mitchell Rhodes' mechanic to make a decision that only Mitchell Rhodes, test pilot, was qualified to make. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Rachel. Game starting. Tommy keeps looking for you. The guilt crashed over him in waves. His son, waiting for a father who'd promised to be there and was about to break that promise yet again. Tommy, who deserved better than a ghost for a parent, who needed consistency and presence instead of excuses about work and responsibilities. But 19 people in the sky needed him more right now. Needed the person he used to be, the pilot he'd tried so hard to bury. Needed him to stop running from his past and remember what it meant to be responsible for lives hanging in the balance. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. Mitchell stood up, pulled off the headset, and turned to Moss. Get me on that aircraft. I'll ride right seat and help bring them in. Moss nodded grimly. I'll arrange a helicopter. But Mitchell, once you do this, everyone's going to know who you really are. There's no going back. I know, Mitchell said, and felt something that had been broken inside him for 7 years suddenly click back into place. Get the helicopter ready. We're running out of time. The helicopter lifted off from the Clearwater Regional tarmac with a violence that matched the weather, wind grabbing the skids and shaking the small aircraft like a toy. Mitchell sat in the back, strapped in tight, watching through the rain-streaked windows as the ground fell away. Lightning flickered close enough that he could feel the static charge in the air, making his skin prickle. Beside him, Captain Moss had insisted on coming along, claiming someone needed to handle communications while Mitchell focused on flying. But Mitchell suspected the truth was simpler. Moss wanted to see this through. Wanted to witness whether the mechanic who guided an aircraft through a killer storm really had the skills to bring it home. The helicopter pilot, a former Coast Guard rescue swimmer named Kate Brennan, fought the controls with practiced efficiency. ETA to intercept is 8 minutes, she shouted over the rotor noise. They're at 15,000 feet, 30 miles out. You've got one shot at this. One shot. The words carried weight that went beyond aviation. One chance to prove he was still the pilot he'd once been. One opportunity to save 19 lives. One moment where everything he'd buried would be exposed to the light. Mitchell checked his harness again. Unnecessary nervous energy that his hands needed to burn off. The last time he'd been in an aircraft as anything other than a passenger, Emma had still been alive. Tommy had been barely old enough to walk. The world had been different, and so had he. You ready for this? Moss asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. No, Mitchell admitted. But I don't think that matters. The helicopter banked hard, giving them a view of the Gulf Stream ahead. Even from a distance, Mitchell could see the aircraft wasn't flying right. The nose was slightly high, the wings rocking in the turbulence, the whole machine fighting to stay in the air. That was a crew at the absolute limit of their capability. Muscle and will barely holding together an aircraft that wanted to fall out of the sky. Brennan brought them in close, matching speed with the larger jet, close enough that Mitchell could see faces in the windows. Passengers pressed against the glass, some crying, some praying, all of them terrified. And there, in the forward cabin, he caught a glimpse of Danessa Voren, her face pale but composed, staring out at the helicopter with an expression he couldn't quite read. This is insane, Brennan muttered as she maneuvered the helicopter directly above the Gulfstream's fuselage. "I can't hold position in this wind for more than a few seconds." "Then we do it fast," Mitchell said, already unbuckling. The plan was risky to the point of suicidal. They'd hover over the aircraft. Mitchell would drop to the fuselage using a rescue harness, then move to the forward door and somehow get inside, while both aircraft were moving at 250 knots. Through turbulent air. It was the kind of thing that worked in movies and got people killed in reality. But the Gulfstream was running out of time and altitude, and getting Mitchell on board any other way meant landing the helicopter, losing precious minutes, potentially losing the aircraft entirely if the systems failed completely before he could intervene. "Ready when you are," Moss said, helping Mitchell into the harness. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that only pilots shared. "You've got this. Trust your training." Mitchell nodded, though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. 7 years since he'd been in a cockpit. 7 years of rust, of atrophied skills, of instincts that might not fire when he needed them. What if he'd lost it? What if the pilot he'd been was truly gone, and all that remained was the ghost pretending to be real? The helicopter door slid open, and wind screamed into the cabin with physical force. Mitchell clipped his harness to the winch line, felt hands steadying him as he moved to the edge. Below, impossibly close, the white expanse of the Gulfstream's fuselage pitched and rolled like something alive. "On my mark," Brennan shouted. 3, 2, 1, go. Mitchell stepped into empty air at 15,000 feet. The harness caught with a jolt that drove the breath from his lungs. He spun wildly for a moment, the world a blur of storm clouds and aircraft metal and pure adrenaline. Then he slammed into the Gulfstream's fuselage, grabbing for any handhold. The wind trying to peel him off and throw him into the prop wash. His fingers found the emergency access panel, the small recessed handle that would open the forward service door from outside. He yanked it, praying the pneumatic system still had pressure, that the door would actually open despite the airspeed and the compromised systems. It did, swinging inward with a rush of cabin air. Mitchell hauled himself through the opening, unclipped from the harness, and tumbled into the forward galley. A flight attendant screamed. Someone shouted. The door slammed shut behind him with a bang that echoed through the cabin. For a moment, Mitchell just lay on the floor, gasping, his hands shaking from adrenaline. Then training took over. He pulled himself up, straightened his clothes, and walked forward toward the cockpit with as much calm as he could. "Project." The passengers stared at him like he'd materialized from another dimension. Danessa Voren rose from her seat, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been recognition. "You," she said. "The mechanic. What are you doing here?" Mitchell didn't answer. He reached the cockpit door, knocked twice, and spoke clearly. "Captain, this is Mitchell Rhodes from Clearwater Operations. I'm coming in to assist with the approach." The door opened. The co-pilot, a younger man with sweat soaking through his shirt, stared at Mitchell like he'd seen a ghost. "How did you get on the aircraft?" "We're at 15,000 feet. "Helicopter," Mitchell said simply, moving past him toward the right seat. "No time to explain. Captain, I need you to brief me on your exact system status." The captain, whose name tag read Wilson, looked at him with wild eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Eyes. Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's done this before," Mitchell said, settling into the co-pilot's seat. His hands found the controls automatically, muscle memory firing despite the years away. The yoke felt right in his grip, the throttles where they should be. The entire cockpit suddenly familiar in a way that made his chest ache. Wilson stared at him for another heartbeat, then made a decision. "We've got intermittent flight control response. No autopilot, degraded instruments, and fuel that's lower than I'd like. Wind shear warnings are going off every 30 seconds. I've been hand flying for the last 40 minutes, and I'm exhausted." Mitchell scanned the instrument panel, taking in the constellation of warning lights and degraded systems. It was bad, but he'd flown aircraft in worse condition. Had once landed a fighter with no hydraulics using only engine thrust to steer. Had brought down experimental craft that were actively on fire. This was just metal and physics, problems that could be solved if you knew where to look. "All right," he said, his voice dropping into the calm cadence of someone completely in control. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to let me fly this approach while you monitor systems and handle radio communications. I need you to trust me, even when what I do doesn't make sense." "Who are you?" Wilson asked again. "Really?" Mitchell's hands moved across the panel, adjusting trim, checking control responses, feeling the aircraft through the stick. 7 years ago, I was a test pilot. Flew experimental aircraft that weren't supposed to be survivable. Set some records that still stand. Crashed more times than I should have lived through. He looked at Wilson directly. "My name is Mitchell Rhodes. I was declared dead in a test flight accident. And right now, I'm the best chance you have of getting these people on the ground alive." The cockpit went silent except for the rumble of engines and the ping of warning chimes. Wilson studied him, looking for deception or insanity, finding neither. "You're Ghost," he said quietly. "The test pilot they called Ghost. I remember the stories. You were a legend." "I was a lot of things," Mitchell said. "Right now, I'm just a pilot trying to bring this bird home. You with me or not?" Wilson's jaw set. "I'm with you." He keyed the radio. "Clearwater Tower, November 7-4 Delta Fox. Be advised we have an additional pilot on board, assisting with the approach." Mitchell took the controls. Felt the aircraft respond sluggishly to his inputs, and immediately understood the problem. The fly-by-wire system was fighting him, trying to smooth out his commands, but adding lag that made precision nearly impossible. "Disconnect the flight augmentation," he said. "If we do that, we're flying pure manual," Wilson protested. "No safety systems." "The safety systems are what's fighting us," Mitchell said. "Turn them off now." Wilson hesitated, then reached overhead and flipped a series of switches. The Gulfstream immediately felt different in Mitchell's hands, more responsive, but also more demanding. Every input now directly translated to control surface movement. No computer smoothing, no artificial stability. It was like being back in the cockpit of a 1960s-era fighter, all muscle and instinct. Mitchell smiled grimly. This was what he knew. This was where he'd lived for 20 years before the crash. "Okay," he said. "Let's fly." Behind them, in the cabin, Danessa Voron stood at the cockpit door, watching through the small window as the man she'd thought was just a mechanic took control of her dying aircraft. She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen, pulling up search results for Mitchell Rhodes test pilot. The first result was an obituary. The second was a photograph from an aviation magazine, a younger man in a flight suit standing beside an experimental aircraft, the caption calling him one of the most promising test pilots of his generation. The third was a memorial page listing his death date as 7 years ago. She looked up from her phone, back through the window at Mitchell, and understanding dawned in her eyes. The quiet mechanic who'd refused to tell her what she wanted to hear. The man who'd looked at her airplane like he'd flown it before. The way he'd stood in the cockpit with the ease of someone who belonged there. He'd been hiding in plain sight. A dead man working on aircraft because he couldn't fly them anymore. And now, because of a storm and a series of failures that shouldn't have been possible, he was forced back into the sky he'd left behind. Voron watched as Mitchell's hands moved across the controls with unconscious grace, talking Wilson through procedures, calling out altitudes and airspeeds, bringing the crippled Gulfstream down through conditions that had beaten its crew. She watched and understood that she was witnessing something rare, a person forced to confront who they really were, unable to hide anymore, choosing to be extraordinary because lives demanded it, The aircraft bucked violently, throwing her against the bulkhead. More screams from the cabin. But in the cockpit, Mitchell's voice remained steady, his hands sure, guiding them down through the darkness toward a runway he couldn't yet see but knew was there. Waiting, because some things you never forget. Some skills live in your bones, written too deep to erase. And sometimes, when the world strips away everything you've built to protect yourself, what remains is exactly what's needed. Mitchell Rhodes had tried to die once, had buried himself beneath another name and another life. But the sky, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet, not even close. The runway lights appeared through the rain like ghosts, barely visible strips of white against the dark gray chaos. Mitchell had the Gulf Stream at 500 feet, fighting cross winds that wanted to push them sideways into oblivion. Every muscle in his body was tense, reading the aircraft through his hands, his feet, feeling the way she wanted to drift left, compensating with rudder and aileron inputs that came from instinct rather than thought. Airspeed 145 knots, Wilson called out, his voice strained but steady. Sync rate 700 feet per minute. Wind 300 at 35 gusting 42. The numbers painted a brutal picture. They were coming in too fast, descending too quickly, with winds that were trying to kill them. Mitchell added a touch of power, felt the engines respond with agonizing slowness. The G650 systems were degraded enough that everything had lag. Every input delayed by fractions of a second that felt like eternities. 300 feet, Wilson said through the windscreen. Mitchell could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, their lights strobing red and blue through the rain. A welcoming committee or witnesses to disaster, depending on the next 60 seconds. His hands made constant tiny corrections, dancing on the controls, reading wind shifts before the instruments could tell him they were happening. 200 feet. Sync rate increasing. The aircraft dropped suddenly, caught in a downdraft that stole 50 feet of altitude in a heartbeat. Mitchell pushed the throttles forward, demanding power the engines were reluctant to give. The Gulf Stream wallowed, hanging on the edge between controlled flight and falling. Behind them, passengers screamed. Someone was praying loudly in Spanish. Vanessa Voren's face pressed against the cockpit door window, pale but focused, watching Mitchell work with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every movement. 100 feet, Wilson's voice cracked slightly. Mitchell, we're too fast. They were. Landing at this speed with questionable brakes and wind pushing them sideways meant they'd use every inch of runway and probably more. But slowing down meant risking a stall in the gusting winds. Meant falling out of the sky 50 feet from safety. Trust me, Mitchell said, his voice carrying absolute certainty he didn't entirely feel 50 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them, white paint streaking by too fast. Mitchell pulled power to idle, raised the nose slightly, felt the main gear kiss concrete with a thud that rattled teeth. The spoilers deployed automatically, dumping lift, trying to plant the aircraft firmly on the runway. But the wind had other ideas. A violent gust from the left pushed them sideways, the Gulf Stream skidding at an angle, tires screaming protest. Mitchell stood on the right rudder, fighting to keep the nose aligned, feeling the aircraft wanting to swap ends, to spin like a weather vane in the storm. Reverse thrust isn't responding, Wilson shouted over the noise of tortured tires and shrieking wind. Mitchell didn't waste breath answering. He modulated the brakes carefully, feeling for the edge of a skid, knowing that locking the wheels meant losing all directional control. They were burning through runway at terrifying speed. Emergency vehicles tracking their progress. Everyone watching to see if the dead test pilot could actually pull off the impossible. 4,500 feet of runway used. 5,000. 5,500. The end of the pavement approaching with mathematical certainty. Mitchell stood on the brakes, felt the anti-skid system fighting him, released and reapplied pressure in a rhythm he'd learned decades ago. The Gulf Stream slowed, but not fast enough. They were going to run out of runway. Going to end up in the grass, maybe flip, maybe turn this miraculous survival into tragedy at the last possible moment. "Brace," he said calmly into the cabin intercom. "Brace for impact." The end of the runway disappeared under the nose. They hit the safety area at 40 knots, the Gulf Stream bouncing over rough ground, everyone thrown forward against their restraints. Metal groaned. Something underneath the aircraft gave way with a sickening crack. And then, finally, impossibly, they stopped. Finally, impossibly, they stopped. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The only sound was rain hammering on the fuselage and the tick of cooling engines. Then the cabin exploded with sound. Crying, shouting, praying. The release of terror held too long in check. Mitchell sat with his hands still on the controls, breathing hard, his entire body shaking with adrenaline dump. Wilson turned to him, tears streaming down his face. "You did it. You actually did it." Through the windscreen, emergency vehicles surrounded them, personnel rushing forward through the rain. Mitchell unbuckled slowly, his fingers stiff, and stood up. His legs felt like water, but he made it to the cabin, made it to where Danessa Varan stood waiting. "Everyone okay?" he asked. She nodded, then did something unexpected. She pulled him into a fierce hug. "You saved us," she whispered. "You brought us home." Mitchell stood awkwardly in her embrace, aware of the other passengers watching, of Wilson emerging from the cockpit, of the cabin door opening to admit paramedics and emergency personnel. His secret was gone. His quiet life was over. Everyone would know now who he really was, what he'd been hiding. The man who died had just saved 19 lives. And there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. The media descended like locusts within 2 hours. News vans lined the perimeter road, satellite dishes sprouting like mechanical flowers, reporters doing breathless stand-ups about the miraculous landing at Clearwater Regional. Mitchell sat in the airport manager's office, wrapped in a blanket someone had insisted he needed, watching the circus unfold on the television mounted to the wall. Test pilot declared dead 7 years ago emerges as hero, the Chiron read. His old military photo filled the screen, younger, cleaner cut, wearing the flight suit he'd once lived in. Then footage of the damaged Gulfstream being towed from the safety area, rescue personnel milling around. And finally a shaky cell phone video someone had captured of Mitchell climbing down from the aircraft. Soaked and exhausted. Jerry stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You want to tell me what the hell just happened? My mechanic is apparently a famous dead pilot?" "I'm sorry," Mitchell said quietly. "I should have told you." "Yeah, you should have." Jerry came in, closed the door behind him. "But I get it. You were running from something. We've all got our reasons." He sat down heavily. "You're done here, you know that? After today, every aviation company in the world is going to want you. Test pilot programs, simulator training, consulting. You can't go back to being anonymous." Mitchell knew Jerry was right. The careful life he'd built, the quiet existence that let him stay close to Tommy while keeping his past buried, all of it was gone. Destroyed in the 30 seconds it took to land an aircraft that everyone watching knew only an exceptional pilot could have saved. His phone had been ringing, nonstop. News organizations, aviation magazines, someone claiming to be from the FAA wanting to ask questions about his certifications and ratings. He'd ignored them all, waiting for the only call that mattered. When it came, Rachel's name on the screen, he answered immediately. "Is it true?" She asked without preamble. "I'm watching the news. They're saying Mitchell Rhodes, the test pilot, saved a plane today. But that's impossible because you're not him. You're just someone using his name, right? Tell me you didn't lie to me for 7 years." "Rachel," he started, then stopped. "No more lies. No more hiding. It's true. I am Mitchell Rhodes, the same one who died in that crash. I survived, and I let everyone think I was dead because I wanted to be with Emma and Tommy. And then when Emma died, I couldn't come back as myself without losing custody of Tommy." The silence on the other end stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. Then, Tommy saw it on TV. He knows. He's asking questions I don't know how to answer. Mitchell's heart clenched. "I'll come get him. I'll explain everything. You can't just show up and explain that you've been lying about who you are his entire life," Rachel said, her voice rising. "He thinks his father is a mechanic named after a dead pilot. Now he's going to find out his father is the dead pilot, alive and apparently famous. How do you think that's going to affect him?" "I don't know," Mitchell admitted. "But I have to try." Before Rachel could respond, a knock came at the office door. Moss opened it without waiting for permission, his face grim. "Mitchell, you need to see this now." On the television, the news had shifted to a press conference. Danessa Voren stood behind a podium bearing the NextCore logo, flanked by executives who'd been on the flight, looking composed and professional despite everything they'd just survived. "Today, my team and I experienced what should have been a fatal emergency," she was saying to the assembled reporters. "We were saved by the extraordinary skill and courage of Mitchell Rhodes, a man who gave up everything to protect his family, who spent 7 years hiding his abilities because he'd made a choice to put the people he loved first." She paused. "Mr. Rhodes is not just a hero. He's a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose family over glory, obscurity over fame, and presence over prestige." The camera flashed to reporters shouting questions. But Voren held up a hand. "I'm establishing a foundation in Mr. Rhodes' name to support families of pilots who've made sacrifices for their careers. Because today taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they achieve, it's what they give up when it matters most." She looked directly into the camera. "Mitchell, if you're watching, thank you. And please, go be with your son. He needs you more than we needed saving." Mitchell stared at the screen, something breaking loose in his chest. Voren had just told the world his story, had framed his disappearance not as deception but as sacrifice, had given him permission, in front of millions, to choose Tommy over everything else. "You should go," Moss said quietly. "I'll handle the press, the FAA, all of it. Just go get your boy." Mitchell nodded, unable to speak. He stood, dropped the blanket, and walked out of the office. Through the terminal, past staring crowds who'd recognized him from the news. Out into the parking lot where his truck waited exactly where he'd left it a lifetime ago that morning. The soccer game was long over by now. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be the father Tommy deserved. Mitchell found them at Rachel's house, a modest 2-story in Brookhaven's quiet residential district. His truck rolled to a stop at the curb, engine ticking in the sudden silence. Through the living room window, he could see Tommy sitting on the couch, still wearing his soccer uniform, staring at something Mitchell couldn't see. Probably the television. Probably watching his father's face appear on every news channel. Rachel met him at the door, before he could knock. Her expression was complicated, anger and relief and worry all competing for space. He hasn't said much. Just keeps watching the news coverage, trying to process it. "Can I talk to him?" She studied him for a long moment. "You break his heart again, Mitchell, and I don't care what you did today. I will make sure you regret it. I know." She stepped aside, letting him enter. The house smelled like Tommy's favorite cookies, chocolate chip, Rachel's way of trying to comfort without words. Mitchell walked into the living room, saw his son look up, their eyes meeting across a distance that felt infinite. "Hi, buddy," Mitchell said, his voice rough. Tommy stared at him. 12 years old, Emma's eyes and Mitchell's stubborn jaw, wearing grass stains and the number 14 that he'd chosen because it was his dad's birthday. "They're saying you're a hero. That you saved all those people. I did what I had to do." They're saying you were a famous pilot. That you died in a crash but didn't really die." Tommy's voice was carefully controlled, the way kids spoke when they were trying very hard not to cry. "Is that true? Are you really Mitchell Rhodes? The real one?" There was no point in anything but honesty now. Mitchell sat down on the coffee table, facing his son. "Yes, I'm the real Mitchell Rhodes. I was a test pilot, and I crashed, and I survived. I let everyone think I was dead because your mom wanted me to quit flying, and I wanted to be with you both. And then when she died, I couldn't come back as myself without losing you." "So you lied," Tommy said flatly. "For 7 years you lied to me about who you are." "Yes, why?" "Because I was afraid," Mitchell said simply. "Afraid that if anyone knew who I really was, they'd take you away. Afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd hate me for leaving your mom alone when she needed me. Afraid that I'd already failed you so completely that the only thing I could do was try to be present, even if it meant being someone I wasn't." Tommy's composure cracked. "You missed my game. Again. You always miss everything because you're always working, always at the airport, always choosing planes over me." The words hit like physical blows. "You're right. I did. And I'm sorry. Everyone at school saw the news. They're all texting me, asking if you're really my dad, if I knew, if I'm going to be famous now." Tommy's voice rose. "I don't want to be famous. I just wanted you to watch me play soccer." Mitchell felt tears burning in his eyes. "I know, and I can't undo missing today. I can't fix 7 years of working too much and being afraid to let you see who I really am. But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I want to try to be the father you deserve, not the ghost I've been." "Are you going to leave?" Tommy asked quietly. "Now that everyone knows, are you going to go back to being a pilot? Go back to your old life? A pilot? Go back to your old life?" The question hung in the air. Mitchell thought about the phone calls stacking up, the offers that would come, the opportunity to reclaim everything he'd walked away from. Thought about the feeling of the Gulfstream's controls in his hands, the rightness of being back in a cockpit where he belonged. Then he looked at his son, and the answer was simple. "No," he said firmly. "I'm staying right here. With you. Because the only flying I want to do is showing up for your games, your school events, your life. Everything else can wait." Tommy studied him for a long moment, evaluating whether to believe, whether to trust the man who'd been lying by omission for his entire memory. Then, slowly, he stood up and crossed the space between them. Mitchell opened his arms, and Tommy collapsed into them, finally letting the tears come. "I'm proud of you," Tommy whispered against his father's chest, "for saving those people. But I wish you'd been at my game instead." "Me too," Mitchell said, his own tears falling freely now. "Me too, buddy." They sat like that for a long time, Rachel watching from the doorway with wet eyes, the television still playing news coverage in the background. The world wanted Mitchell Rhodes the hero, the legend, the test pilot who cheated death and saved 19 lives, but Tommy just wanted his dad. And for the first time in 7 years, maybe Mitchell could finally be both. 3 weeks later, Mitchell stood at the edge of a runway at Edwards Air Force Base, watching the sun paint the California desert in shades of gold and crimson. Beside him, Tommy clutched a plastic model of a Gulfstream G650, the same type of aircraft his father had landed during the storm. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered. Rachel, Captain Moss, Jerry, even Kate Brennan from the helicopter rescue. Danessa Voren approached across the tarmac, wearing jeans and a leather jacket instead of her usual corporate attire. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "You flew us here in your jet," Mitchell said with a slight smile. "Would have been rude to decline." She laughed. "Fair point." She gestured toward the hangar behind them. "The foundation is officially launched. We've already got applications from 50 families who need support. Pilots who sacrificed careers for their kids. Spouses who held everything together while their partners were flying. People who made the hard choices and paid the price. That's good work, Mitchell said sincerely. It's your work, Voren corrected. Your story inspired it. Your choice to be a father first, everything else second. She paused. Speaking of which, I have something for you. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a check with enough zeros to make his eyes widen. What's this? Consulting fee, Voren said. I'm hiring you as NextCore's aviation safety advisor. You'll review our procedures, train our pilots, ensure we never cut corners on safety again. It's remote work, flexible hours, and it pays well enough that you can actually spend time with your son instead of working double shifts. Mitchell looked at the check, then at Tommy, who was watching with wide eyes. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Tommy said quietly. It sounds cool. Moss stepped forward. I've also got an offer. The FAA wants you to help redesign emergency training protocols. They figure if anyone knows how to save an aircraft that shouldn't be savable, it's you. Part-time, consultancy basis, your schedule. Mitchell felt something tight in his chest finally loosen completely. A path forward that didn't require choosing between who he was and who he needed to be. A way to use his skills without abandoning his son. A second chance that actually felt like one. Okay, he said. Yes to both. But nothing happens during soccer season. Tommy's games come first. Tommy grinned, the first genuine smile Mitchell had seen since the day of the landing. Can we go up in a plane sometime? Like, just us? So you can show me what you do. Mitchell knelt down to his son's level. Absolutely. Anytime you want. He paused. And buddy, I know I can't undo the years I was absent, or the fact that I lied about who I was. But I promise, from now on, you get the real me. All of it. The good parts and the parts that are still figuring things out. Tommy thought about this. The real you is pretty cool, actually. Even if you did miss a lot of games. Well, the real you is even cooler, Mitchell said. And I'm lucky to be your dad. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors, Mitchell stood with his son and watched aircraft take off in the distance. The sky called to him still, would always call to him. But now he understood that answering that call didn't mean abandoning everything else. It meant finding balance, meant being present, meant showing up not just for emergencies, but for ordinary moments that mattered more. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know where this story found you, whether it's a quiet corner of your home, a busy commute, or somewhere in between. If this tale of second chances and choosing what matters most touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story for more powerful narratives that honor courage, redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to be truly present for the people who need us. Because in the end, heroism isn't just about saving lives in dramatic moments. It's about showing up day after day for the people who love you. It's about choosing presence over prestige, connection over recognition, and family over glory. It's about being brave enough to be who you really are, even when hiding feels safer. Mitchell Rhodes learned that lesson the hard way, through loss and lies and 7 years of running from himself. But he learned it. And now, standing beside his son under an endless sky, he finally understood what Emma had been trying to tell him all along. The most important flight you'll ever make is the one that brings you home. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and remember that it's never too late to choose what truly matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.